Today, this House will vote on a motion that calls on the government to officially recognize the genocide against the Uyghur people. Reports indicate that the Prime Minister and Cabinet will abstain from this vote. Will the government uphold democratic norms, respect the will of this House and the terms of the motion, and officially recognize the Uyghur genocide?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said very many times in the past, we are very preoccupied with the reports that have come out of China with respect to the treatment of Uyghurs. The Conservative Party brought forward a motion. We will vote on that today, and I will not try to anticipate or predict the outcome of that vote.
Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, tomorrow the Prime Minister has a meeting with President Biden. We know that the issue of China will be discussed. Will the Prime Minister raise the issue of the genocide against the Uyghur people in his meeting with President Biden?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable colleague for the question. The Prime Minister and President Biden will discuss a number of issues, some of which are related to international matters and some of which are related to China. I cannot speculate on the specific content of those discussions, but China will certainly be raised.
Depend on it. When the Prime Minister thought, who should I buy them from? He looked around the world and he said, I know, the country that's holding our people hostage. You can imagine the PRC Politburo filled with bureaucrats rolling around on the ground in gut-splitting laughter at this Prime Minister's naivete. Madam Speaker, simple question. When he wasted 100 days in the PRC, what the hell was he thinking?
Anyone? I mean, it's just $250 million. I mean, what's that between friends, right? Anyone? Any data? No?
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner.
Thank you, Chair.
By Mr. Generous, moved that A, in the opinion of the House, the People's Republic of China has engaged in actions consistent with the United Nations General Assembly Resolution 260, commonly known as the Genocide Convention, including detention camps and measures intended to prevent births as it pertains to the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. And B,
given that, one, where possible, it has been the policy of the Government of Canada to act in concert with its allies when it comes to the recognition of a genocide. Two, there is a bipartisan consensus in the United States where it has been the position of two consecutive administrations that Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims are being subjected to a genocide by the government of the People's Republic of China. The House, therefore, recognize that a genocide is currently being carried out by the People's Republic of China against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims, and call on the government to officially adopt this position. Amendment. Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, seconded by Mr. Bergeron, moved the following amendment: that the motion be amended by adding after the words "against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims" the following: call upon the International Olympic Committee to move the 2022 Olympic Games if the Chinese government continues this genocide.
all those in favor of the amendment and participating in person will please rise.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Deltel.
Monsieur Berthold.
Monsieur Berthold.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Dalton.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Tucker.
Mr. Barrett.
Mr. Barrett.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mrs. Falk, Battleford, Lloydminster.
Mr. Ruff.
Mr. Ruff.
Ms. Shin.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Ananda Sangari, 4 pour.
Mr. Badaway.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Badaway, 4 pour.
Mr. Bagnall.
I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Bagnall, 4 pour.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Baines, 4 pour.
Mr. Baker.
Speaker, I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Baker, 4 pour.
Mr. Batiste.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Batiste, 4 pour.
Mr. Beach.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of this motion.
Mr. Beach, 4 pour.
Madame Bendayen.
Monsieur le Président, je vote en faveur de la motion.
Madame Bendayan, 4 pour.
Madame Bissett.
Je vote pour.
Madame Bessette, pour 4.
Mr. Biddle.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Biddle, 4 pour.
Mr. Blois.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Blois, 4 pour.
Mr. Casey.
Je vote pour la motion.
Mr. Casey, pour 4.
Ms. DeBrusen.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Bruson, 4 pour.
Ms. DeMoff.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. DeMoff, 4 pour.
Mr. Dollywall.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Dollywall, 4 pour.
Mr. Duguid. Mr. Duguid. Ms. Zarowitz.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Zarowitz, 4 pour.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Easter, 4 pour.
Mr. Assassi. Mr. Assassi. Mr. Ellis.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Ellis, can I get you to repeat? Your camera didn't
Nope,
keep...
we got
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Ellis, 4 pour.
Mr. Erskine Smith.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Erskine Smith, 4 pour.
Mr. Fergus.
Président, je vote en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Fergus, can I get you to repeat? Maybe try lowering the boom on the mic.
Président, je vote en faveur de la motion.
Mr. Fergus, pour 4.
Okay.
Mr. Fillmore.
In favor of the motion.
Mr. Fillmore, pour 4.
Mr. Finnegan.
In favor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Finnegan, 4 pour.
Mr. Fisher.
In favor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Fisher, 4 pour.
Mr. Fonseca.
I vote in favor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Finnegan, can I get you to or Mr. Fonseca, can I get you to repeat, please?
I vote in favor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Fonseca, 4 pour.
Mr. Fragascatos.
In favor, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Fragascatos, 4 pour.
Mr. Fraser.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Fraser, 4 pour.
Vous m'entendez?
Ms. Fry.
Attendez un instant.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
We got it.
Ms. Fry, 4 pour.
Mr. Garneau.
Mr. Speaker, I abstain on behalf of the Government of Canada.
Mr. Garneau, abstention, abstention.
Mr. Hardy.
What was that about?
Well, Mr. Hardy votes in favor.
Hardy, 4 pour.
Mr. Housefather.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Housefather, 4 pour.
Ms. Ian.
In favor, Mr. Speaker.
Ian, 4 pour.
Ms. Jazik.
I vote for the motion.
Ms. Jazik, 4 pour.
Mr. Jahari.
Mr. Speaker, I vote for the motion.
Mr. Jahari, 4 pour.
Mr. Kellaway.
In favor of the motion.
Mr. Callaway, 4 pour.
Ms. Khalid.
I vote in favor of the motion, Mr.
Ms.
Speaker.
Khalid, 4 pour.
Ms. Kara.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Kara, 4 pour.
Madam Koutrakis.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Koutrakis, 4 pour.
Mr. Kuzmaricek.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Kuzmaricek, 4 pour.
Madame Lalonde.
Je vote pour la motion.
Madame Lalonde, pour 4.
Madame Lambropoulos.
I vote in favor of the motion.
Madame Lambropoulos, 4 pour.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Mr. Lamoureux, 4 pour.
Ms. Latanzio.
Mr. Speaker, I vote in favor of the motion.
Ms. Latanzio, 4 pour.
Monsieur Lefebvre.
En faveur.
Monsieur Lefebvre, 4.
Monsieur Lightbound.
What the hell was he thinking?
Yeas pour 266, 266. Nays contre, 0, aucun.
I declare the motion as amended carried. With a point of order, the honourable member.